For years, you've been drinking under assumptions that aren't true. The habits you've trusted, the hangover remedies you've recommended, and the alcohol facts you've repeated with confidence are built on myths. It's time to set the record straight. 1. There's a drinking rule that's been passed around for decades, like it's scientific fact. Beer before liquor, never been sicker. People actually structure their entire night around that rhyme, believing their liver somehow keeps track of which drink arrived first. It doesn't. Your body is interested in exactly one thing: the total amount of alcohol you consume. Blood alcohol concentration is determined by how much ethanol enters your system, how quickly you drink it, your body weight, and how efficiently your body metabolizes alcohol, not whether beer came before vodka or after it. Researchers tested this directly in a study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, comparing both drinking orders in real volunteers. The result was the same. Hangover severity showed no meaningful difference, regardless of which beverage came first. The myth survives because beer is usually consumed earlier in the night at a slower pace, while liquor tends to appear later, when people start drinking much faster. So the order gets blamed instead of the increased rate of consumption. The sequence was never the issue. Beer after vodka or vodka after beer leads to the same biological calculation and the same outcome every time. The only thing that old rhyme has ever been good at preserving is the myth itself. 2. Few alcohol myths are as deeply woven into popular culture as the image of a St. Bernard carrying a barrel of brandy through a snowstorm to save stranded travelers. People still treat a shot of whiskey like emergency cold weather protection, convinced it somehow helps the body stay warm. In reality, alcohol does the exact opposite. It triggers peripheral vasodilation, causing blood vessels near the surface of your skin to widen and send more warm blood toward the outside of your body. Your face feels warmer. Your hands feel warmer. But your core temperature is quietly falling. That comforting sensation isn't your body producing heat. It's your body losing it more quickly. That's why alcohol is a well-established contributor to hypothermia. Many victims feel perfectly comfortable long before their condition becomes life-threatening. The U.S. military specifically warns against drinking alcohol during cold weather survival because of this effect. Research on cold water immersion has also shown that intoxicated people lose core body heat faster than sober individuals, even as they report feeling warmer. The warmth is genuine. The protection is an illusion. A bottle of liquor isn't a winter survival tool. It's like opening the window in a freezing room and mistaking the draft for comfort. 3. You've seen this scene in countless movies. Someone has had far too much to drink, and a well-meaning friend slides over a steaming cup of coffee with complete confidence. Coffee sobers you up. It doesn't. What coffee actually creates is an awake, drunk person, not a sober one. You may feel sharper, more alert, and more capable, but the alcohol is still affecting your brain and body exactly the same way. Your liver clears ethanol at a fixed rate of roughly 0.015% blood, alcohol concentration per hour, and caffeine has absolutely no effect on that process. It can't speed it up. What caffeine does is mask alcohol's sedative effects, reducing the drowsiness that might otherwise tell someone to stop drinking or stop making decisions. The National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism has found that combining alcohol with caffeine increases the likelihood of risky behavior because people feel more capable while remaining just as impaired. Researchers even have a name for this condition: the wide-awake drunk. The exhaustion is hidden, but the slowed reaction time, poor judgment, and impaired coordination remain. That's one reason the FDA banned caffeinated alcoholic beverages in 2010. A cup of coffee isn't reversing intoxication. It's simply making an impaired person feel far more confident than they should. 4. Almost everyone has said this at some point. usually after watching someone order another round. Every drink kills brain cells. It was taught in classrooms, repeated by parents, and accepted as unquestionable fact for decades, which is exactly why it's worth taking. Apart, moderate alcohol consumption does not destroy neurons. What it does is far more nuanced. Research published in Neuropsychologia found that moderate drinking does not cause widespread neuronal death. Instead, alcohol temporarily disrupts the electrical and chemical signals neurons use to communicate with one another. The cells are impaired, not eliminated. Heavy, long-term alcohol abuse can damage dendrites, the branch-like structures neurons rely on to send and receive information, but even that damage can improve after prolonged abstinence in many cases. The severe brain disorder most people associate with alcoholism, Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, is primarily caused by a deficiency of thiamine, or vitamin B1, which is common among heavy drinkers with poor nutrition, not by ethanol directly killing brain cells. The myth gained momentum during anti-alcohol campaigns in the 1980s, when images of brains affected by end-stage alcoholism were often presented as though they represented ordinary drinking. Saying every alcoholic drink kills brain cells is like claiming every car trip ends in a fatal crash. The category is the same. The reality is completely different. 5. Picture the determined athlete dragging themselves into the gym the morning after a night of drinking, convinced that enough cardio or time in the sauna can sweat the alcohol out of their body. Detox through perspiration. Earn your recovery through suffering. The problem is that biology doesn't work that way. Less than 10% of alcohol leaves your body through your breath, sweat, and urine combined. More than 90% is processed by the liver, and it does so at a fixed metabolic rate that no workout can accelerate. A hangover isn't caused by alcohol still sitting in your muscles. It's driven by dehydration, the buildup of acetaldehyde, a toxic byproduct of alcohol metabolism, electrolyte imbalance, and disrupted sleep. None of those problems are solved by forcing yourself onto a treadmill while feeling miserable. In fact, exercising with a hangover can make things worse by increasing dehydration and placing additional strain on your cardiovascular system, which is already under stress after heavy drinking. Research published in the Journal of Clinical Medicine has found that the only consistently effective hangover remedies are time, hydration, electrolytes, and food. Not the rowing machine, not the sauna. Sweating is your body's cooling system, not its alcohol disposal system. Trying to sweat out a hangover is like trying to empty a flooded basement by opening the attic windows. The effort feels productive, but it has nothing to do with fixing the actual problem. 6. The volume always rises once the drinks start flowing. Conversations become louder, people head to the dance floor, and suddenly everyone seems bolder, funnier, and full of energy. It looks like alcohol is acting as a stimulant. It isn't. Alcohol is pharmacologically classified as a central nervous system depressant, in the same broad category as sedatives. The burst of energy people think they feel is really the result of what alcohol shuts down first. As ethanol enters the bloodstream, it suppresses activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for judgment, restraint, and self-control. The brakes come off. You're not gaining energy, you're losing inhibition. From the inside, those sensations can feel remarkably similar, but biologically, they're completely different. Research published in Neuropsychopharmacology has shown that alcohol's so-called stimulating phase is actually disinhibition, the removal of behavioral restraints, not the addition of stimulation. As blood alcohol concentration continues to rise, the depressant effects become impossible to ignore. Slower reaction times, impaired coordination, drowsiness, and eventually unconsciousness. That distinction matters because mixing alcohol with true stimulants, such as amphetamines, places significant strain on the cardiovascular system by sending the body conflicting chemical signals at the same time. Alcohol doesn't add horsepower. It simply removes the speed limiter from an engine that was already running. The rush feels exhilarating, right up until you reach the next corner. 7. Vodka drinkers often wear a certain confidence when the topic of hangovers comes up. Whiskey, bourbon, dark rum, those are supposedly the drinks that guarantee a miserable morning. Clear liquor is treated as the smarter choice. Dark liquor gets the blame. Like many alcohol myths, this one starts with a real scientific observation before being stretched far beyond what the evidence actually says. Dark spirits generally contain higher levels of congeners, natural byproducts of fermentation and aging, such as methanol, acetone, and tannins, which can make hangovers, especially headaches and nausea, more severe. A study conducted at Brown University found that people who drank bourbon experienced worse hangovers than those who drank the same amount of vodka. But here's the detail that often gets ignored. Both groups were impaired to exactly the same degree while drinking. Vodka doesn't eliminate the hangover. It simply removes some of the extra compounds that can make it feel worse. The dehydration, disrupted sleep, and acetaldehyde buildup caused by alcohol itself remain virtually unchanged no matter which clear or dark spirit you choose. On top of that, inexpensive versions of almost any liquor often contain more congeners than higher quality bottles, making production methods and overall quality more important than color alone. Choosing vodka to dodge a hangover is like choosing a lighter hammer to hit your thumb. The impact is smaller, but you're still waking up with the consequences. 8. Almost everyone has said this at some point. I know when I've had enough. I know my limits. The remarkable part is that people usually say it while under the influence of the very substance that makes accurate self-judgment less reliable. It's a perfect paradox. Alcohol impairs metacognition, the brain's ability to evaluate its own condition. As intoxication increases, your confidence often rises, even while your actual abilities decline. Study after study using standardized impairment testing has shown that people routinely underestimate their blood alcohol concentration while overestimating how well they're performing. There's essentially a chemically induced version of the Dunning-Kruger effect. At moderate to high blood alcohol levels, participants frequently rated their driving, coordination, and decision-making as equal to, or even better than, their sober performance, despite objective testing showing clear deterioration. Even experienced bartenders aren't especially good at judging intoxication. One study found they identified intoxicated customers only slightly better than random chance. That's one of the reasons legal blood alcohol limits exist in the first place. Human self-assessment proved so consistently inaccurate that enforcement had to rely on an objective chemical measurement instead. Asking a drunk person whether they're sober enough is like asking a faulty thermometer to verify its own reading. The instrument making the judgment is already compromised. 9. There's the ritual meal before the first drink. A plate of pasta, a greasy burger, a basket of bread, whatever promises to soak up the alcohol. People treat food like a layer of armor, convinced it gives them extra drinking capacity without paying the price later. It doesn't. Food absolutely slows the absorption of alcohol, but it doesn't reduce the total amount your liver eventually has to process. You're traveling the same road at a slower pace, not taking a different route. Fat and protein delay gastric emptying, so alcohol reaches the small intestine, where most absorption takes place, more gradually, producing a slower rise in blood alcohol concentration. Research published in the British Journal of Clinical Pharmacology found that eating before drinking only modestly lowers the peak blood alcohol level from a fixed amount of alcohol. The peak arrives later and climbs more slowly, but it still arrives. The real danger is what happens next. People feel less intoxicated early in the evening, assume they can safely drink more, consume more alcohol overall, and end up just as impaired, or even worse off by the end of the night. The effect of that meal also fades after roughly 2 to 3 hours as the stomach empties and alcohol absorption catches up. Eating before you drink is a speed bump, not a concrete barrier. It delays the journey. It doesn't change the destination. 10. The nightcap. One of the oldest, most elegant traditions in drinking culture. A small glass before bed, something smooth to help you drift off. Almost like a prescription wrapped in good manners. It sounds therapeutic. The reality is far less comforting. Alcohol does help you fall asleep by depressing activity in the central nervous system. The problem is what happens after you lose consciousness. It acts like a sedative on the way in, then quietly dismantles the quality of your sleep for the rest of the night. The reason is specific. Alcohol suppresses REM sleep, the stage essential for memory formation, emotional processing, and mental recovery, especially during the second half of the night. As your liver breaks down the alcohol, the brain experiences a rebound effect that leads to fragmented sleep, frequent waking, and unusually vivid or unsettling dreams. Research from the University of Melbourne found that even moderate alcohol consumption before bed reduced overall sleep quality by as much as 24% when measured using brainwave recordings. The long-term problem is even worse. Tolerance to alcohol's sedative effects develops quickly, meaning larger and larger amounts are needed to produce the same sleepy feeling, creating a well-documented pathway toward dependence. Using alcohol to fix insomnia is like repairing a leaking roof by removing more shingles. It may seem to solve the problem at first, but over time it guarantees a much bigger one. 11. I can drink way more than most people. I have a high tolerance. It's often said with quiet confidence, as though it's proof of resilience or good genetics. In reality, it's usually evidence that the brain has spent years adapting to the repeated presence of alcohol. High tolerance isn't an advantage. It's a clinical warning sign. Tolerance develops through neuroadaptation. Over time, the brain reduces the sensitivity of GABA receptors while increasing glutamate activity to counter alcohol's depressant effects. That pattern of adjustment is one of the defining neurological features of developing dependence. A person with high tolerance experiences the same liver strain, cardiovascular stress, gastrointestinal irritation, and other organ-level damage as someone with lower tolerance drinking the same amount. They simply don't perceive the impairment as strongly. Metabolic tolerance develops as well, with the liver becoming more efficient at processing ethanol. But that adaptation has limits and carries its own long-term costs. The most serious consequence appears when a highly tolerant person suddenly stops drinking. Those same compensatory brain changes can trigger withdrawal symptoms ranging from anxiety and tremors to life-threatening seizures. The stronger the adaptation, the more severe the rebound can become. High tolerance isn't your body becoming tougher. It's your internal warning system slowly being trained to stay silent while the damage continues. 12. People have been treating alcohol as medicine for centuries. The logic sounds simple enough. Alcohol kills germs, so a hot toddy or a shot of whiskey must help fight off a cold. It feels almost medicinal. The chemistry says otherwise. For alcohol to function as an effective antiseptic, its concentration generally needs to be between 60% and 90%. Beer typically contains around 4% to 7% alcohol. Wine sits between 12% and 15%. Even most distilled spirits reach only about 40% to 50%, far below the level needed to reliably destroy pathogens. During the cholera outbreaks of 19th century Europe, beer and wine were often safer to drink than contaminated water, but not because the alcohol was disinfecting anything. They were safer because the beverages themselves were less likely to contain disease-causing organisms. Drinking alcohol while you're sick can actually weaken your immune response. It interferes with white blood cell function and reduces the activity of the tiny cilia lining your respiratory tract that help remove invading pathogens, making it harder for your body to recover. Research published in the Alcohol Journal found that even moderate alcohol consumption during illness can suppress the innate immune system by as much as 30%. The idea starts with the right category, but ignores the scale. The concentration needed to disinfect your body would damage your own tissues long before it eliminated a virus. Treating a cold with alcohol is like bringing a garden hose to a burning skyscraper. The tool sounds related. The reality is completely different. 13. Movies have trained generations to believe the same scene. Someone gets wounded in the middle of nowhere, uncorks a bottle of whiskey, pours it over the injury, grits their teeth, and keeps moving. Alcohol becomes emergency. Medicine in a glass bottle. The reality is much less dramatic. Pouring drinkable alcohol onto a wound doesn't properly sterilize it, and it can actually damage the tissue you're trying to heal. Recovery depends on healthy fibroblasts and active white blood cells, the cells responsible for rebuilding damaged tissue and fighting infection. Ethanol at the concentrations found in liquor, typically around 40% to 50%, is toxic to those cells. It harms the very biological systems needed for healing. Modern antiseptics, such as properly formulated iodine solutions and medical-grade chlorhexidine, are designed to kill harmful microbes while minimizing damage to the surrounding tissue. That's why organizations like the American College of Emergency Physicians do not include beverage alcohol in modern wound care recommendations. The myth has historical roots. During the Civil War, whiskey was sometimes used because better options simply weren't available, not because it was an ideal treatment. Somewhere along the way, a desperate battlefield improvisation became cinematic heroism, and cinematic heroism became accepted medical advice. A butter knife may have an edge, but that doesn't make it a surgeon's scalpel. 14. Every drinker seems to have their own personal rule. Never mix grain and grape. Don't combine dark and light. Stick to one type of alcohol all night. Everyone has a story that proves their version is right. The problem is that none of those rules agree with each other, which is the first sign they're not describing an actual biological process. Your liver processes ethanol exactly the same way, no matter where it came from. Whether the alcohol was made from grapes, grains, sugarcane, or agave, the ethanol molecule entering your bloodstream is chemically identical. The enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase doesn't know or care what was printed on the bottle. What people are actually noticing comes from other factors. Sugary cocktail mixers can increase nausea on their own, while carbonated drinks speed up alcohol absorption, causing blood alcohol concentration to rise faster. Those effects are often blamed on mixing alcohols instead of the ingredients doing the mixing. Nights that involve several different drinks also tend to involve consuming more alcohol over a longer period of time. The variety isn't causing the hangover. It's usually a sign that you simply drank more. The myth survives because people want a simple explanation for a miserable morning. Blaming the combination of drinks is like blaming the order of the shovels for the depth of the hole. The real cause was how much digging you did. 15. The name itself has convinced millions of people that beer is uniquely responsible for belly fat. Wine is somehow different. Spirits are supposedly safer. Beer alone gets blamed for expanding the waistline, as though it has a special route to your abdomen. It doesn't. Alcohol contains about 7 calories per gram, almost as energy dense as fat, which contains 9 calories per gram, and far more calorie dense than carbohydrates, which contain 4. Your body also gives ethanol metabolic priority, burning it before other nutrients and making the calories from the food you eat alongside it more likely to be stored as fat. That process happens regardless of whether the alcohol came from beer, wine, whiskey, or tequila. A standard beer, a standard glass of wine, and a standard shot of liquor all contain surprisingly similar calorie counts. The total amount you drink matters far more than the type of beverage. Alcohol also raises cortisol levels, which encourages the accumulation of visceral fat around the abdomen and that effect applies across every category of alcoholic drink. Research published in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition found no significant difference in abdominal fat gain between beer, wine, and spirit drinkers, consuming equivalent amounts of alcohol. A beer belly is really just a calorie surplus with memorable marketing. Change the bottle, and your metabolism still builds the same waistline. 16. For years the public was told that moderate drinking, especially red wine, might actually be good for the heart. The French paradox became a staple of health reporting. Headlines praised wine drinkers for their cardiovascular health, and even some physicians treated a nightly glass of Merlot as a perfectly reasonable lifestyle choice. That conclusion has since come under intense scrutiny, and the scientific consensus has shifted dramatically. Much of the original evidence was weakened by a fundamental comparison problem. Many early studies placed former drinkers who had quit because of poor health into the same category as lifelong non-drinkers. That meant the non-drinking group contained a disproportionate number of people who were already ill, making moderate drinkers appear healthier by comparison. One of the most influential analyses, a 2018 Mendelian randomization study published in The Lancet examining more than 600,000 participants, concluded that there is no completely safe level of alcohol consumption for overall health, with cancer risk increasing even at low levels of intake. The often cited compound resveratrol in red wine also fails to rescue the argument. The amounts used in laboratory studies are so high that reaching them through wine consumption would require drinking quantities that would be dangerously toxic. In response to the growing body of evidence, organizations such as the American Heart Association and the World Health Organization have moved away from recommending alcohol for cardiovascular benefits. The idea of alcohol as heart medicine is becoming another chapter in medical history, a recommendation that once sounded convincing until better evidence forced it to be quietly abandoned. 17. The morning after drink. Pouring yourself a little more of the very thing that caused the problem and calling it the solution. Hair of the dog is either one of the most ingenious pieces of self-deception in drinking culture or one of the most obvious, depending on how generous you're feeling. What it actually does is delay the hangover, not eliminate it. You're borrowing relief from the future and paying it back with interest. Part of a hangover is a genuine withdrawal response. As blood alcohol concentration drops after heavy drinking, the brain's adaptive changes, reduced GABA activity, and increased glutamate signaling, briefly throw the nervous system out of balance. Taking another drink temporarily suppresses those effects, creating the illusion that you've fixed the problem. Pharmacologically, it's the same mechanism that underlies the early stages of alcohol dependence. Using alcohol to ease alcohol withdrawal is one of the classic warning signs of developing dependency. Meanwhile, the real causes of the hangover, dehydration, acetaldehyde accumulation, electrolyte imbalance, and poor sleep, remain completely unresolved. They're simply pushed further down the timeline, while additional alcohol adds even more work for your body. Research published in the Annals of Emergency Medicine found that the hair of the dog approach prolongs recovery by extending the body's metabolic burden. It's the neurological equivalent of taking out a payday loan. The relief arrives immediately. The bill always comes later, and it's always larger than the one you started with. 18. One of the most damaging myths surrounding alcohol is the belief that people with alcohol use disorder simply lack self-control, that it's a failure of character rather than a medical condition. That idea isn't just inaccurate. It keeps people from seeking treatment and contributes to worse outcomes. Alcohol use disorder is recognized as a disease by every major medical authority in the world. The changes it causes in the brain are real, measurable, and often require professional treatment to overcome. Long-term alcohol use produces well-documented alterations in the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the brain's reward system, regions responsible for judgment, impulse control, and decision-making. These aren't abstract theories. They're changes that can be observed with modern brain imaging. Genetics also play a major role, with studies estimating that roughly 50% to 60% of the risk for alcohol use disorder is inherited, placing it in a similar range to conditions like type 2 diabetes. The American Medical Association officially recognized alcoholism as a disease in 1956, and the DSM-5 classifies alcohol use disorder as a diagnosable, treatable medical condition with clearly defined levels of severity. Research has repeatedly shown that treating it as a moral failure increases shame, discourages people from getting help, and leads to measurably poorer outcomes. Telling someone with alcohol use disorder to simply have more willpower is like telling someone with a broken leg to run a marathon. Judgment doesn't repair the injury. Treatment does. 19. The elegant ritual of wine tasting carries an unspoken assumption. The careful swirl, the slow sniff, the thoughtful sip, the confident declaration that the more expensive bottle must also be the better one. Price and quality are expected to rise together, and your palate is supposed to recognize the difference. Decades of blind tasting research suggest the relationship is far weaker than most people believe. A study published in the Journal of Wine Economics found that untrained drinkers actually showed a slight negative relationship between price and enjoyment under blind conditions. On average, they preferred the less expensive wines. Experts performed somewhat better, showing a modest correlation between price and perceived quality, but nowhere near strong enough to justify the enormous differences in price. In another experiment, researchers poured the exact same wine into bottles carrying different price tags. Participants consistently rated the expensive wine as tasting better, and brain scans using fMRI even showed greater activation in pleasure-related regions despite the wine being identical. Perceived quality turned out to be influenced by far more than the liquid itself. Label design, bottle weight, the confidence of the person serving it, the setting, and especially the listed price all shaped the experience. Your taste buds never saw the price tag. Your expectations did the tasting long before the wine reached your tongue. 20. The image of the brilliant, alcohol-fueled artist has become one of the most enduring myths in modern culture. The drink comes out, the inner critic disappears, and suddenly inspiration is supposed to flow without restraint. Questioning that idea almost feels like questioning art itself. The reality is much less romantic. Alcohol reduces many of the mental abilities that creativity depends on, while creating the convincing illusion that they're working better than ever. One part of the story is true. At very low blood alcohol concentrations, around 0.03% to 0.04%, research has found a small improvement in divergent thinking, the ability to make unusual connections between ideas, largely because inhibition is reduced. But creativity doesn't end there. Convergent thinking, the ability to judge ideas, refine them, organize them, and turn them into finished work, begins to decline even at those low levels of intoxication. You may produce more ideas while becoming worse at recognizing which ones are actually worth keeping. A study published in Consciousness and Cognition found modest gains in moments of insight during mild intoxication, but not in the sustained concentration and disciplined execution required to transform those ideas into meaningful work. Many of history's most celebrated artists who drank heavily produced their greatest work while sober, with the drinking happening between creative sessions rather than during them, a detail the legend rarely mentions. Alcohol doesn't create genius. It simply quiets the internal editor. And without an editor, most of what gets written sounds far better at midnight than it does the next morning. 21. Almost every gathering has someone who confidently says they can't drink red wine because of the sulfites. The diagnosis is delivered with complete certainty. The headaches are blamed, the case is closed. The science is considerably less straightforward. Sulfites are actually found in greater concentrations in most white wines than in red, and in dramatically higher amounts in many everyday foods. Red wine typically contains around 50 to 100 parts per million of sulfites. White wine can contain as much as 200 parts per million. Dried apricots can exceed 2,000 parts per million. If someone eats dried fruit without any symptoms but blames red wine solely on sulfites, there's a strong chance they're overlooking a much more likely explanation. Genuine sulfite sensitivity is uncommon, affecting roughly 1% of the population, and it most often causes respiratory reactions in people with asthma rather than headaches in otherwise healthy adults. Researchers have instead pointed to other possible contributors to red wine headaches, including biogenic amines such as histamine and tyramine, tannin-related serotonin responses, and quercetin, a flavonoid found in grape skins that a 2023 study published in Scientific Reports identified as a likely trigger. Much of the sulfite myth gained momentum after the FDA required sulfite warning labels on wine bottles in 1988. Many consumers interpreted them as a general health warning instead of an allergen disclosure. Blaming every red wine headache on sulfites is like solving a mystery after deciding the culprit before you've looked at the evidence. 22. The after-work drink to unwind. The glass of wine before a social event to calm your nerves. Alcohol has become the socially accepted remedy for stress and anxiety, available on restaurant menus, at family gatherings, and in nearly every grocery store. The problem is that while alcohol temporarily eases anxiety, it steadily makes the underlying problem worse over time. It isn't a treatment. It's a cycle that charges you later for the relief it gives you now. Alcohol boosts GABA activity while suppressing glutamate, producing a genuine short-term calming effect that can last for a few hours. That part is real, but as your blood alcohol concentration begins to fall, the brain responds with a rebound increase in glutamate activity, triggering a surge of anxiety that is often stronger than the stress that led you to drink in the first place. That's one reason hangxiety so often feels wildly out of proportion to anything that actually happened the night before. Long-term studies have found that people who regularly rely on alcohol to cope with anxiety are significantly more likely to develop generalized anxiety disorder than those who don't, and the relationship appears to run in that direction. Around 1 in 5 people diagnosed with an anxiety disorder also experience alcohol use disorder, with each condition making the other progressively more difficult to treat. Using alcohol to cope with anxiety is like taking out a high-interest loan on your own peace of mind. The relief comes first. The repayment always costs more than you borrowed. 23. The disciplined drinker who alternates every alcoholic drink with a glass of water. 1 beer, 1 water. 1 cocktail, 1 water. The assumption is that each glass is quietly undoing the damage of the last, keeping the hangover at bay 1 sip at a time. Water certainly helps, but not in the way most people think. It reduces dehydration. It does not lower your blood alcohol concentration, speed up acetaldehyde metabolism, restore disrupted sleep, or reverse the other biological processes that create a hangover. It fixes one piece of a much larger puzzle. Alcohol suppresses antidiuretic hormone, increasing urination and causing significant fluid loss. Replacing that water is absolutely beneficial because dehydration is a genuine contributor to hangover symptoms. But the nausea, headaches, and overall misery caused by acetaldehyde, the toxic byproduct created as your body breaks down ethanol, remain completely unaffected by hydration alone. Alcohol also depletes electrolytes along with fluids, and in extreme cases, drinking only plain water without replacing those electrolytes can worsen the imbalance. Studies evaluating hangover treatments consistently find that time, electrolyte replacement, food, and appropriate anti-inflammatory medication provide greater relief than water by itself. Alternating alcohol with water is smart harm reduction. Believing it makes you immune to a hangover is like bringing an umbrella into a hurricane and expecting to stay dry. One problem was addressed. The rest kept moving exactly as before. 24, it seems intuitive that if two people drink the same amount on the same night, they should experience roughly the same level of intoxication and recover at about the same pace. Human biology doesn't work that way. The differences in how male and female bodies process alcohol are well established, consistent, and rooted in physiology, not tolerance, toughness, or self-control. Women generally have a lower percentage of body water, averaging around 52%, compared with about 61% in men. That means the same amount of alcohol is diluted through less fluid, producing a higher blood alcohol concentration from an identical number of drinks. Women also tend to have lower levels of gastric alcohol dehydrogenase, the enzyme that begins metabolizing ethanol in the stomach before it reaches the bloodstream, allowing more alcohol to be absorbed from the same dose. Hormonal changes throughout the menstrual cycle also influence alcohol metabolism, with studies showing stronger intoxication effects during the luteal phase. The long-term health risks differ as well. Women develop alcohol-related liver disease, cardiomyopathy, and several alcohol-associated cancers at lower levels of consumption and after fewer years of heavy drinking than men. Research from the National Institutes of Health concludes that applying identical drinking recommendations to everyone ignores fundamental biological differences in metabolism and physiology. Expecting identical outcomes from identical drinks is like prescribing the same medication dose to every patient regardless of body size or biology. Equal drinks do not produce equal results. 25. Liver disease dominates almost every conversation about alcohol. It's the organ everyone associates with drinking, the one featured in every warning label and public health campaign. That creates an easy assumption. If your liver is still functioning, the rest of your body must be doing fine. The evidence says otherwise. Alcohol is a systemic toxin with well-documented effects on multiple organ systems, many of which begin accumulating damage long before liver disease is ever diagnosed. Cardiovascularly, chronic heavy drinking can cause alcoholic cardiomyopathy, a direct weakening of the heart muscle, while also increasing the risk of atrial fibrillation and hemorrhagic stroke. Neurologically, the damage extends beyond dependence itself. Long-term alcohol use has been linked to accelerated cortical thinning and the loss of white matter, changes that can be observed on MRI scans. Cancer risk is another major concern. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies alcohol as a Group 1 carcinogen, with established links to cancers of the mouth, throat, esophagus, colon, rectum, and breast, regardless of whether liver disease is present. The immune system is affected as well. Regular heavy drinking weakens both innate and adaptive immunity, increasing vulnerability to illnesses such as bacterial pneumonia, tuberculosis, and postoperative infections. The warning about the liver is accurate, but it's only part of the story. Focusing only on your liver while ignoring everything else alcohol affects is like watching a single dashboard warning light, while the engine, transmission, and brakes are all failing at the same time. One symptom, a body-wide problem. 26. This myth deserves a category of its own because it sits underneath so many others. The belief that you can quickly lower your blood alcohol concentration through the right trick or enough determination has spawned an entire family of false cures. Coffee, exercise, food, cold showers. The answer to every one of them is exactly the same. None of them meaningfully reduce blood alcohol concentration. Once alcohol is in your bloodstream, your body removes it at a biologically fixed pace that cannot be hurried by anything the average person can do outside a medical setting. For most adults, the liver metabolizes ethanol at roughly 0.015% blood alcohol concentration per hour, with only modest variation between individuals. That rate is controlled by enzyme activity, not motivation, supplements, or internet hacks. Researchers once investigated intravenous fructose as a possible way to speed alcohol metabolism, but the effects were minimal and limited to highly controlled clinical conditions. Eating fruit has no measurable impact. Activated charcoal only works if given almost immediately after ingestion, before alcohol has been absorbed, and it cannot remove alcohol that's already circulating in the bloodstream. There is also no approved prescription medication in any major country that can rapidly sober up a healthy intoxicated person. Your blood alcohol concentration follows its own biological timetable. It has no interest in your deadlines, your confidence, or your certainty that this time you'll somehow beat the chemistry. 27. It's easy to assume that beer, wine, and spirits all carry the same addiction risk, simply because they contain the same molecule, ethanol. That's chemically true, but biologically incomplete. The speed at which alcohol reaches the brain, shaped by its concentration, carbonation, and the way it's consumed, can significantly influence the risk of developing dependence, even when the total amount of alcohol is identical. Addiction is strongly influenced by reinforcement, and reinforcement becomes more powerful when the reward arrives faster. High-proof spirits consumed rapidly deliver ethanol to the brain more quickly, producing stronger reward signals and reinforcing drinking behavior more efficiently. Carbonated alcoholic drinks can increase alcohol absorption by as much as 50% compared with similar non-carbonated beverages, according to research published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, resulting in a faster effect on the central nervous system and a more potent reinforcement response. The World Health Organization has also linked sweet, high-alcohol premixed beverages to higher rates of problem drinking among adolescents, partly because their sugar content masks the taste of alcohol, while their formulation produces rapid intoxication. Drinking patterns matter just as much. A single glass of wine with dinner creates a very different pattern of reinforcement than quickly consuming several shots at a party. The chemistry may begin with the same molecule, but the route still matters. Not every road carries the same level of risk, even if they all lead to the same destination. 28. The phrase empty calories has led many people to believe alcohol is nothing but wasted energy with absolutely no nutritional value whatsoever. That's mostly correct, but not entirely. And that small distinction is often used in misleading ways. Ethanol provides about 7 calories per gram, while contributing virtually no meaningful nutrition of its own. It's calorie-dense and nutritionally poor. Fermented drinks, however, do contain small amounts of naturally occurring compounds depending on how they're made. Beer contains modest levels of silicon and certain B vitamins. Wine contains polyphenols and other plant-derived compounds. The important part is that these nutrients exist only in trace amounts and are nowhere near sufficient to make alcohol a worthwhile nutritional source. At the same time, ethanol interferes with the body's ability to absorb and retain key nutrients, increasing the loss of vitamins and minerals, such as zinc, magnesium, and vitamin B12, while reducing overall nutrient absorption. That's why these partial nutritional claims are so often used in alcohol marketing. Wine gets promoted for its antioxidants. Beer is advertised as containing minerals. The implication is that these benefits somehow offset the risks, even though the overall scientific evidence shows they do not. Pointing out that wine contains polyphenols while ignoring the effects of ethanol is like praising a house fire because it gives off heat. The statement is technically true in one very narrow sense. It completely misses the much larger problem. 29. When the United States increased the federal minimum drinking age to 21 in 1984, alcohol-related traffic deaths among 18 to 20-year-olds fell by roughly 16%, translating to an estimated 20,000 or more lives saved by 2,000, according to data from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. The familiar argument is that restricting alcohol only makes it more appealing to teenagers, pushing drinking into riskier, less supervised settings. It's an intuitive idea. The evidence points in a different direction. Countries that have reduced their minimum drinking ages have generally experienced increases in underage alcohol consumption, impaired driving, and alcohol-related hospital admissions in the years that followed. The biology also matters. The human brain continues developing until around age 25, with the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for judgment, impulse control, and risk evaluation, being one of the last areas to fully mature. Alcohol exposure during this period has been linked to a substantially greater risk of developing alcohol use disorder later in life. International comparisons also fail to support the claim that lower drinking ages produce less binge drinking among young people. The forbidden fruit argument sounds persuasive until it's tested against real-world outcomes. History is full of predictions that public health restrictions would simply increase risky behavior. Again and again, the data has shown a far more complicated reality. 30. The term non-alcoholic sounds absolute. No alcohol. A safe alternative for someone in recovery, for a pregnant person, for the designated driver, or for anyone who needs to avoid alcohol completely. The reality is more nuanced. Most beverages sold as non-alcoholic are de-alcoholized rather than entirely alcohol-free, meaning they still contain small amounts of residual ethanol that can matter for the people who need that. Amount to be zero. In the United States, products labeled non-alcoholic may legally contain up to 0.5% alcohol by volume. The European Union uses a similar limit. A typical 330 milliliter bottle at 0.5% ABV contains roughly 1.3 milliliters of pure ethanol, a small quantity, but one that can add up over several drinks. For many people recovering from alcohol use disorder, the greater concern isn't even the residual alcohol itself. It's the smell, the taste, the familiar ritual, and the social cues, all of which are well-established triggers for relapse regardless of ethanol content. Obstetric guidance also advises pregnant individuals to avoid beverages containing residual alcohol because no safe level of fetal alcohol exposure has been established. For most consumers, that remaining alcohol is unlikely to be significant. But for the people who truly depend on complete abstinence, the difference between low alcohol and zero alcohol is medically meaningful. It's a distinction that deserves to be obvious on the label, not hidden in the fine print. 31. Every New Year's Eve brings the same warning. Champagne gets you drunk faster because of the bubbles. Sparkling wine is treated like it has some unique shortcut to intoxication that other drinks don't. The truth is both simpler and less dramatic. Carbonation does speed up the onset of intoxication, but it does so through a basic physiological mechanism, and the same effect applies to any carbonated alcoholic beverage, not just champagne. The bubbles increase stomach pressure and accelerate gastric emptying, allowing alcohol to reach the small intestine, where most absorption takes place, more quickly than flat drinks. A controlled study published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences found that people consuming the same amount of alcohol in a carbonated beverage reached their peak blood alcohol concentration roughly 10 to 15 minutes sooner than those drinking a non-carbonated version. The effect is genuine, but it's modest. It changes how quickly the blood alcohol curve rises, not the total amount of alcohol your body ultimately absorbs. Champagne's reputation is probably driven more by the circumstances than the chemistry. It's usually consumed at celebrations, often on an empty stomach, in crowded social settings where drinks are poured quickly and consumed just as fast. Those factors do far more to accelerate intoxication than the bubbles themselves. The carbonation played a role. The empty stomach, the fast pace, and the endless refills quietly did the rest. 32. It happens after almost every party. Someone sits for a few minutes, drinks a bottle of water, starts feeling more awake, and decides they've taken the necessary precautions before getting behind the wheel. The problem is that water only fixes dehydration. it does nothing to lower blood alcohol concentration, restore reaction time, or reverse the impaired judgment that safe driving depends on. Driving ability begins to decline well before most legal limits are reached. Studies have documented slower reaction times and increased lane deviation at blood alcohol concentrations as low as 0.05%, while the legal limit in most of the United States remains 0.08%. The improvement people feel after drinking water comes partly from relieving dehydration and partly from the simple fact that time has passed, allowing the liver to metabolize a small amount of alcohol at its normal fixed rate. Adding coffee to the equation makes the situation even more deceptive by creating the alert but impaired state discussed earlier. A person may feel completely ready to drive while remaining objectively impaired on every meaningful measure of coordination and judgment. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration data repeatedly shows that many impaired drivers believed they were perfectly capable of operating a vehicle before the crash. Feeling better after drinking water is not the same thing as becoming sober. It's the same impairment with fewer symptoms. The road treats both exactly the same. 33. The explanation often sounds simple. Alcohol causes violence. Remove the alcohol, and the violence disappears. The drink becomes the entire explanation. The evidence shows a relationship that is real, but far more complex than straightforward chemical cause and effect. Cross-cultural studies have found striking differences in alcohol-related aggression between societies with very different drinking norms. Communities with similarly high levels of alcohol consumption have historically displayed vastly different rates of violent behavior, suggesting that culture shapes the outcome just as much as the chemistry. Experiments using alcohol placebos, giving people beverages they believed contained alcohol when they actually didn't, have also found measurable increases in aggressive behavior based on expectation alone. Belief itself changes behavior before the pharmacology does. The biological mechanism is different. Alcohol suppresses activity in the prefrontal cortex, weakening impulse control, and reducing the brain's ability to weigh long-term consequences. Rather than creating aggression from nothing, it removes restraints that normally keep existing aggressive tendencies in check. Psychologist Claude Steele described this effect as alcohol myopia, a narrowing of attention that magnifies immediate provocations while pushing future consequences out of view. People already inclined toward conflict often become more confrontational. Those without those tendencies don't suddenly acquire them. Alcohol doesn't manufacture aggression. It lowers the barriers that were containing it. The problem was already inside the building. Alcohol simply shut down the security system. 34. Alcohol poisoning is usually imagined as a young person's tragedy. The college freshman at a house party. The inexperienced drinker who didn't know when to stop. A coming-of-age mistake with catastrophic consequences. The statistics tell a very different story. In the United States, alcohol poisoning deaths occur far more often among middle-aged adults than teenagers, and that pattern has remained remarkably consistent over years of surveillance. Data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention repeatedly shows the highest death rates among adults between the ages of 35 and 64, with men accounting for roughly 76% of all fatalities. That pattern reflects years of chronic heavy drinking, rather than isolated episodes of youthful excess. Long-term drinkers often develop high tolerance, allowing them to consume dangerous amounts of alcohol without experiencing the usual warning signs, nausea, poor coordination, or passing out, that stop less experienced drinkers much earlier. Alcohol poisoning occurs when blood alcohol concentration becomes high enough to suppress the brainstem functions that control breathing, heart rate, and the gag reflex, often at levels around 0.30% to 0.40%, though individual tolerance varies. Ironically, that same tolerance can make reaching these life-threatening concentrations easier by masking the body's normal alarm signals until it's too late. Alcohol poisoning isn't primarily a problem of inexperience. It's a problem of dose. And the people most at risk are often the ones who have spent years quietly training their bodies to tolerate more than they ever should. 35. The way many people describe a first DUI minimizes the pattern behind it. I wasn't really that drunk. I've driven like that plenty of times before. I just happened to get caught this time. The arrest gets framed as bad luck, a random consequence from an otherwise normal behavior. The data suggests something very different. Before the average impaired driver receives a first DUI arrest, they have already driven over the legal alcohol limit an estimated 80 times without being stopped, according to research from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. The arrest is not usually the beginning of the behavior. It is the first visible interruption in a pattern that has been happening repeatedly. Impaired driving deaths also follow a measurable pattern. Roughly 1/3 of all traffic fatalities in the United States involve a driver with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.08% or higher, a predictable outcome connected to a specific, preventable behavior. DUI offenders also face substantial repeat offense rates without intervention, with about 30% becoming repeat offenders, and the risk increasing significantly among people with diagnosable alcohol use disorder. The statement, "I didn't feel that drunk," is actually consistent with what alcohol does to the brain. Self-assessment and judgment are impaired early, often before obvious physical signs appear. Calling a DUI unlucky after dozens of successful impaired drives is like calling a crash unexpected after ignoring the same warning sign over and over again. The outcome was never the unlikely part. Only the timing was. 36 beer goggles has become such a recognized idea that it has almost turned into a cultural term of its own. The concept is familiar. Alcohol makes other people appear more attractive than they normally would. What gets discussed far less is that alcohol also changes how people evaluate themselves, often creating an exaggerated sense of personal attractiveness with its own consequences. Research has shown that alcohol can increase ratings of other people's physical appeal, especially when judging faces that fall near average attractiveness. Extremely attractive or unattractive faces appear to be less affected by this shift. But the more consistent finding is that alcohol changes self-perception even more dramatically. Studies have found that people who consume alcohol tend to rate images of themselves as more attractive compared with sober individuals viewing the exact same photos. The mechanism comes from the same reduction in prefrontal control that lowers social anxiety. Alcohol doesn't simply make people less nervous. It also weakens the internal critic responsible for self-evaluation and caution. Combined with a reduced perception of social consequences, the result is increased confidence and more outgoing behavior, not because appearance has changed, but because the person's interpretation of themselves has changed. Alcohol doesn't make you look better. It makes you judge yourself more favorably, while slightly altering how you evaluate everyone around you. The reflection in the mirror is exactly the same. The person interpreting it is running different software. 37. The French paradox. Mediterranean longevity. The familiar image of long dinners, fresh ingredients, and a glass of wine as the secret behind a healthier, longer life. France has often been presented as the ultimate example of this idea, but the reality is far more complicated. France has historically ranked among the higher alcohol-consuming countries in Europe, and has also experienced significant rates of alcohol-related liver disease, alcohol-associated cancers, and traffic deaths. The French paradox, the observation that cardiovascular mortality appeared relatively low despite high saturated fat consumption, has increasingly been explained by researchers through broader differences in diet, lifestyle, healthcare, and historical patterns of death reporting rather than wine itself. The health benefits associated with a Mediterranean diet are real, but they come from the entire pattern: high intake of vegetables, legumes, olive oil, fish, and generally moderate calorie consumption. Wine exists within that lifestyle. It is not the engine driving it. Separating one component and crediting it for the outcome is like praising a single musician for the performance of an entire orchestra. Across Europe, alcohol consumption has declined in many countries over recent decades as public health awareness and messaging have changed. The idea that Europeans drink wine freely and somehow escape the consequences forever is built on carefully selected images, cultural assumptions, and misunderstood statistics. It is a postcard version of reality, where the fine print was removed before anyone started reading. 38. The hangover cure industry has built a massive business around one simple promise: that the consequences of drinking can be chemically reversed the next morning. Supplements, recovery drinks, IV hydration clinics, and specialized products all sell the same underlying idea. Someone has finally found the solution to the morning after. The problem is that no commercially available hangover treatment has demonstrated strong clinical effectiveness in properly controlled, peer-reviewed, randomized trials. The entire category relies heavily on expectation and borrowed scientific credibility. A systematic review published in the British Medical Journal, along with later evaluations, found no convincing evidence that any marketed hangover remedy consistently reduces symptoms beyond what would be expected from placebo effects. Expensive intravenous hydration treatments offered at specialty clinics may sound more advanced, but for most people they provide benefits comparable to drinking fluids and replacing electrolytes by mouth at a fraction of the price. Dihydromyricetin, a compound extracted from a specific plant and promoted in some supplement markets, has shown interesting results in animal studies, but human evidence remains limited and far from conclusive. Anti-inflammatory medications can help with one specific aspect of hangovers, the prostaglandin-related headache pathway, but they also carry increased risks of stomach irritation when combined with recent alcohol consumption. A narrow fix with its own downside attached. The hangover cure industry is one of the most successful placebo markets in modern wellness. It sells the sensation of recovery to people who are tired, uncomfortable, and highly motivated to believe that the solution has already been bottled. 39. The instinctive comparison people make between legal and illegal substances often assumes regulation itself is proof of relative safety. Alcohol is licensed, taxed, sold openly in stores, and present at nearly every major social event. Therefore, the reasoning goes, it must naturally belong in a safer category than prohibited drugs. The problem is that legal status and biological harm are measured on completely different scales. A landmark study published in The Lancet by drug policy researchers evaluated 20 substances based on overall harm, including both damage to the individual user and consequences imposed on society. Alcohol ranked as the most harmful substance overall, surpassing drugs such as heroin, crack cocaine, and methamphetamine, largely because of its widespread availability and its enormous social impact through violence, accidents, healthcare costs, and family disruption. Alcohol also carries a unique medical danger through withdrawal. Severe dependence can lead to life-threatening seizures, cardiovascular instability, and dangerous nervous system reactions. While withdrawal from many other substances can be extremely difficult, alcohol withdrawal has a particularly serious potential for direct medical complications. According to the World Health Organization, alcohol contributes to more than 3 million deaths globally each year, a number that exceeds deaths from many illegal substances combined when adjusted for how widely each substance is used. Alcohol's legal status is not the result of a modern scientific ranking of safety. It reflects centuries of cultural acceptance, economic importance, and social integration that existed before today's regulatory systems. Legal means society has chosen to permit it. The chemistry itself does not recognize the law. 40. Drunk texting has become one of the most universally recognized examples of alcohol-related poor judgment. It's treated as a modern comedy category, a slightly embarrassing message, a regrettable confession, something friends laugh about the next morning and quickly move past. But reducing impaired digital communication to a harmless joke overlooks consequences that can be far more serious. Research published in Alcohol and Alcoholism found that alcohol-related texting and social media behavior consistently showed increased boundary crossing, weaker social restraint, and emotional disclosures beyond a person's normal self-control limits. Digital disinhibition under alcohol is not a separate phenomenon. It is the same loss of behavioral regulation that occurs face-to-face. The prefrontal cortex impairment that removes social filters in a conversation also removes them behind a screen. The mechanism is identical. The environment is simply different. The major difference is permanence. An intoxicated comment spoken in a room is usually witnessed by a limited audience and eventually disappears. A message or post can be saved, copied, shared, searched, and preserved indefinitely. A Career Builder survey found that social media content discovered during candidate screenings influenced hiring decisions for a significant number of employers. The professional, personal, and legal consequences of alcohol-fueled digital behavior are often underestimated because the action feels temporary in the moment. Drunk texting is not just drunk conversation. It is drunk conversation with a recording device attached. The words were still sent. The difference is that now there is evidence, and evidence does not sober up. 41. The idea of alcohol as social lubrication is one of the most deeply embedded stories in drinking culture. Lowered inhibitions, increased confidence, less anxiety, more comfort with intimacy. The connection between alcohol, nightlife, and attraction is so familiar that the underlying biology is rarely questioned. The reality is that alcohol disrupts many of the physical systems involved in sexual function, while primarily enhancing the perception of confidence and readiness. A significant difference exists between feeling capable and actually being capable. In men, alcohol acts as a vasodilator and can interfere with erectile function through a predictable pharmacological pathway. Research has consistently shown dose-dependent reductions in erectile performance as blood alcohol concentration rises. In women, alcohol can reduce genital blood flow and natural lubrication responses, even while increasing reported feelings of sexual desire. Laboratory studies have repeatedly demonstrated this disconnect between psychological arousal and physical response. Sexual performance and orgasm quality also decline as intoxication increases in both men and women. The same reduction in inhibition that makes a situation feel more appealing can interfere with the neurological coordination required for the experience itself. Alcohol also remains the substance most frequently involved in sexual assault situations, with extensive evidence showing its role in impairing judgment, decision-making, consent capacity, and awareness of risk. Alcohol creates the confidence to move toward an experience while simultaneously weakening many of the systems needed to navigate that experience safely and effectively. It is one of biology's most convincing illusions, selling the feeling of capability while quietly reducing the actual capacity behind it. 42. The most comfortable assumption is also one of the most misleading. If I actually had a problem, I would know. There should be an obvious line, a clear warning sign, a defining moment where everything suddenly becomes undeniable. But alcohol use disorder often undermines exactly the ability required to recognize it. The same neurological changes involved in the condition can interfere with accurate self-assessment. The measuring device has been altered by the very thing it is attempting to measure. The DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for alcohol use disorder include continuing to drink despite awareness that it is causing problems. But that awareness depends on correctly identifying the connection between alcohol use and those consequences. Research consistently shows that many heavy drinkers, especially those who maintain jobs, relationships, and outward stability, underestimate both how much they drink and how much risk is involved. The average delay between the beginning of problematic drinking and seeking treatment is more than 10 years. According to data from the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, underestimating the severity of the issue remains one of the most commonly reported barriers to getting help earlier. High-functioning heavy drinkers are especially vulnerable to this pattern because they often use the absence of dramatic consequences, losing a job, destroying relationships, or reaching a visible crisis, as their definition of what a real problem looks like. The Cage questionnaire reduces the assessment to 4 questions. Have you ever felt you should cut down? Have people annoyed you by criticizing your drinking? Have you felt guilty about drinking? Have you ever needed a drink first thing in the morning? 2 or more yes answers suggest a possible alcohol use disorder. Yet, many people who would answer yes to several of these questions never recognize the pattern as a medical condition. Sometimes the hardest person to convince is the one doing the evaluation. The assessment that matters most may be the one coming from outside your own perspective. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Don't forget to share it with others who might find it interesting. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.